All right, if it's snowing outside, I wouldn't know.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't either.
We're mic'd up. All right. Usually we do this at the end of the OpenStack Summit. We sit down, have a chat.
That's true.
Today it's the first day, so we don't really know what's going to happen the next couple of days yet.
I know.
But we know what happened today.
Yeah, that's true. So we're trying something new.
Yeah. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about the role of foundations and about open source licensing.
Sure.
Kind of the two topics that are on everybody's. Really, you guys don't know us. Mark, introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Mark Collier, COO with OpenStack Foundation.
And Frederic Lardinois, news editor at TechCrunch. For those
So as you were saying, we usually chat and do an interview off in the corner somewhere, and we thought, why not do it on the stage this time?
Do it in public, do it live.
Yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Let's freaking do it live.
All right, let's do it. As far as foundations go, the OpenStack Foundation has been through quite a few changes. And at this point, you're doing all these different projects. And there's questions out there whether you're still as committed to OpenStack, the core OpenStack project, as you were before. Are you?
Well, first of all, yes. We're absolutely as committed as ever to OpenStack. If you look at the fact that at the moment there are 2 pilot projects that the foundation has helped get established and 2 that have now been confirmed. It's a small number compared to the many, many projects that are within OpenStack. And I can tell you that I personally am very committed. Not only does my shirt say OpenStack, but my license plate on my car is actually Stacker. So I'm all in, and I think that OpenStack is where our roots are. It is one of the 3 most active open source projects in the world right now, right up there with the Linux kernel and Chromium. And if you walk around and talk to everybody here, they're talking about what they're doing with OpenStack. They just need other pieces to fill in the gaps to secure their containers or to run it in an edge environment. So there's use cases that demand more open source than what should fit in OpenStack. So I think it actually reflects an ability to, in some ways, focus more on OpenStack by being very clear about what the boundaries are, not trying to take every idea that comes along and say, well, this should go in OpenStack, and say, look, if a community is interested in the OpenStack model of open source, which is a bit different than some other models, and they want to form up and have the help of the foundation, if it fits within infrastructure and it's helpful to OpenStack users, then we're absolutely willing to entertain that, and we've now have these 4 projects that are part of the foundation, 2 in pilot phase, 2 in confirmation phase. So I think it's easy to get draw the wrong conclusion and think that, oh, this is somehow distracting from OpenStack. Many of these projects are coming from OpenStack users, like AT&T with Airship. They were just up here speaking, and they said, in order for us to be even more successful with OpenStack, in order for us to use OpenStack for 5G, we need other pieces. Airship helps bring it together. We need things like Kubernetes, and that's great. So they're taking these pieces together, and we're helping them with the Airship component.
But then the argument is that this is taking your focus away. You're doing too much. OpenStack by itself is so complicated. It's got so many projects by itself. Shouldn't those projects maybe just go somewhere else, and you can still use them, you can still collaborate, but the foundation should focus on OpenStack?
Yeah, I think that where that point of view is maybe misses the mark, in my opinion, is that it's, the foundation is a nonprofit that helps facilitate communities that are developing software. So the foundation isn't employing thousands of developers. We had 1,500 developers contribute to Stein. We couldn't possibly employ them all. That's not the model. We help communities that are actually helping themselves get established with a method of open collaboration that's been proven to work at scale. And so for us as a foundation to help other communities that are forming up, that doesn't take away from OpenStack. The OpenStack community continues to exist. The OpenStack Foundation continues to support that community. So it's really not a zero-sum game. Just because a new set of developers says, hey, I want to go over here and build some software, and that software happens to be not part of OpenStack, that doesn't mean the people working on OpenStack stop what they're doing and say, well, I guess since this is happening, we're gonna stop improving Nova. I mean, that's just not what is happening in reality. 1,500 developers in the Stein release 2 weeks ago from 150 different organizations. So that community, that process of writing software has never been healthier. So I think we feel good about it when you look at the facts.
Though some of them probably want to go out and chase the shiny new thing instead of the old OpenStack that's been around for 10 years.
It's I believe in freedom, so people should chase what they want. We're going to stick with the plumbing, and so we're not trying to host thousands of open source projects. We're not trying to do things that are irrelevant to OpenStack users. We're helping communities form that are building software that is actually very relevant to OpenStack users, and it's specifically at the infrastructure layer. So I think that's, if people want to go off and to some other shiny layer of the stack, then yeah, they should go do that.
Sure. Well, there are other foundations that have not thousands of projects, but dozens of projects. Is that something you're going after? Because there seems to be a bit of a competition for projects at this point between, if you call them by name, the CNCF and the Linux Foundation and you guys.
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing that comes to mind when you mention that is this morning, Mark Shuttleworth gave a keynote. And one of the things he said is he really believes that it's the wrong approach for a foundation to basically only talk about the projects it hosts. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you go back to 2015 in May, we had a summit in Vancouver, beautiful place, and we had a keynote that featured Kubernetes. This is before they even had a foundation for that specific project. And since then, it's been in, I think, almost every keynote we've ever had. So any sort of open source that's relevant to what our user community wants to use to solve problems, we will talk about it, promote it, we'll help with the testing, we'll do integration. So I think that the track record is clear that our philosophy is not to shun a piece of technology because it isn't part of our foundation. Like that, to me, is a ridiculous notion. And frankly, I think if you think about the history of open source, it was really in some ways you could argue a reaction against like monopolies. Like I don't want this company to monopolize this thing. We need open source where we have these essential freedoms. And so I would suggest that probably you don't want a monopoly in terms of one company monopolizing a project. You probably don't want a monopoly in foundations. The more choices there are out there, the better. And like I said, 150 organizations contributed to Stein release of OpenStack. So we have a very, broad approach to welcoming any and all open source projects. And I'll actually just point one more thing out, which is it's absolutely fine, in my opinion, if your project is not at a foundation at all. I mean, there are projects that were actually discussed in the keynote this morning that aren't in foundations, and they may never end up in a foundation. That's totally fine. So our motivations are not about sort of building the biggest foundation. Our motivations are about helping the most people use open source for their infrastructure. And whatever that is, in some cases we will end up hosting projects and helping communities form around them. But in many cases, a lot of the pieces in those clouds are not hosted at our foundation. It's totally fine. It's great.
Now, you're talking a lot about the collaboration between foundations. Do you always feel that love is shared back from the other foundations, that they want to collaborate as much with you as you want to? Is it like a play date where you show up and you want to?
So I guess I would answer that in two ways. One is, I think that I often talk about collaboration between communities. And I actually believe it's the communities that matter. The foundations, I know they sort of end up in the headlines sometimes, but it's not
my fault. Sorry about that.
True, it is his fault. But that's not really the point of it. The point is the communities. We have 105,000 members, in this community from 187 countries. So the question is, how can the different open source upstream communities work together to solve the end goal of the user? So is it about the foundations? Hopefully not. The second part of the question is sort of asking me, for the point of view of, say, another foundation, I would just say I can't give you their point of view.
Sure.
Since I don't.
Do you sometimes sit down with them for dinner and have conversations about?
Oh, yes, sure. Yes, we've had, we definitely regularly talk with folks that are at all levels of of other foundations out there, executive directors and wherever. So, to me, I mean, I keep going back to we're all just individuals, and the more transparent we are, the more we're doing things in the open, and we're doing this interview right here on stage, the more people can decide for themselves which communities to get involved in, which pieces of technology to put together, which ones are going to work. And just to again go back to a very concrete example, OpenStack and Kubernetes, which are two of the most, I'd say, interesting, exciting projects in the cloud space. There's very real, very healthy collaboration between those communities. And in fact, if you think about the way Kubernetes is tested, every new release of Kubernetes has to pass a certain set of tests that show that it will continue to work with the providers, which is sort of like the glue code that installs it onto different infrastructure. And in the early days, they would say, okay, we can't ship a new version of Kubernetes unless it runs on AWS. So they had that green check mark. Then they added Google, or maybe vice versa, I don't remember. But somewhere along the way, in the last couple of years, OpenStack was added to that. And that was through a lot of work, both within the Kubernetes community, the OpenStack community. And in fact, there are many people who are in both communities. It's really not a siloed thing. Chris Hodge, who is probably doing another session somewhere, has done a lot of work sort of, spanning those communities. And then on the OpenStack side, when new code commits come in, we make sure that they don't break something in that interface between OpenStack and Kubernetes. So if you look at the reality of the software being written, the people who are writing it, the story is a really strong one. And it's not really particularly about foundations, but that's okay.
Sure, that's the world we live in right now, right? Because there is competition for sponsors, there is competition for projects to some degree. That's fair, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I would say it's fair to say that projects tend to pick a foundation or not have a foundation. Right. They don't tend to live at more than one in terms of where they're officially hosted. But hopefully we don't let that get in the way of just collaborating amongst the people. Because, I think, again, I'll go back to something Mark Collier said this morning. He's like, I don't think anyone asked for some sort of foundation war. Well, let me just say plus one. I'm not asking for a foundation war. That's absurd. So, yeah, I would agree with that sentiment.
Foundation wars of 2019.
Yeah, that'd be a good
headline.
Again, would it be a good headline? I wouldn't say so, no.
Not for you.
My opinion.
Right. Now, you did say not every project needs to be in a foundation, right? What's the advantage, though, if I do get my project in a foundation?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that I can certainly speak for the OpenStack Foundation. I think that one of the things that we do with the specific approach we have to open source is that we really strongly believe in having lots of contributors, a level playing field. We have this thing we call the 4 opens, which is open source, open community, open development, open design, and glad I got all 4 of those.
You should know that. That's
quick. Glad I remember them.
I thought it was the 5th one.
Well, people are always trying to find the 5th one that was discussed this morning. But I think that open mind, right? But yes, I think that the point of that is we do provide, I think, a lot of help in establishing projects that can then attract more companies that employ more developers. I've mentioned this stat about 150 organizations contributing to the last release of OpenStack. That's the trajectory that we expect and want to achieve for certain open source projects. Now, not everybody who starts an open source project wants that. Right? And maybe this is where we might want to talk about the next topic.
You figured out my segue. Thank you.
Okay. So not everybody thinks that's a great idea. And we're not here to tell the world, there's only one way to do open source. There is a way we do it, which is one in which we really do think that it's important that there not be one company dominating the project. That's been fundamental to OpenStack from the beginning, and all the 4 projects that have come along since to be part of this foundation believe in that as well, and they want that. And so we help to, I think, kind of ensure that through the 4 opens process and the type of governance that's required, frankly, to be part of the foundation. But if you want that result, it's a good requirement. If you don't, then obviously you probably wouldn't call us up.
Right. So what I was getting at, obviously, is there are quite a few companies that are open source but control the project.
Sure.
And a lot of them accuse AWS and others these days of stealing their work, not contributing back. And it's not so much an OpenStack. I don't think you've ever faced anything like that at OpenStack. But what's your take on that? Because we've got this whole issue with the Commons Clause licenses now.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that, first of all, where we sort of come down on it as a community and as a foundation is that, we actually voted on this yesterday in the board meeting, and we've done some other talk about it before, but there's a OSI as a group that sort of is considered the keeper of whether a license is or is not true open source, and there's all kinds of details to that, but we support that, and I think that for me it's just a question of why are you doing open source? Because in my opinion, again, if you're concerned about a monopoly forming, then the solution to that is not necessarily to create a license that ensures there's a monopoly. I have an economics background, so I guess I was sort of drawn to open source because it was not necessarily inclined towards creating monopolies, but perhaps the opposite. More opportunity for more companies in more countries. So I think that those companies that have grown really big in many cases because of the large communities that they've been able to grow because they're open source are sort of experimenting right now with what happens when we kind of like turn off some of the freedom that was inherent in the license, and so that's obviously at odds with how we do open source. I think it's more of a personal opinion as far as how that's going to go. I don't have a perfect crystal ball, but I think that I actually honestly think it's unfair in a lot of ways to paint some of the public clouds in a negative light to some degree if they're simply using the software under the license in which it was created. I mean, that's what the license says. So,
right. But that's the legal argument. Isn't the spirit of the license I should give back? Well, you would expect your contributors to give back if they.
I mean, I would say this. I would say that over the long haul, no open source project is going to succeed if no one's contributing to it. However, I think that we haven't yet seen the kind of doomsday scenario play out. And I think what you've actually seen are glimpses of some of these companies that have been, sort of maligned, starting to actually open source more things. I mean, obviously Kubernetes came from Google. AWS just open source Firecracker, which we had a talk about that this morning during the keynotes. So, I mean, I guess the good versus evil thing oftentimes doesn't quite resonate with me because I think it's always, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But I think, permissive licenses permit you to do things that include turning it into a business and not necessarily giving all the code back. So, that's a decision you make when you pick that license. I know it gets into sort of legalese, but I mean that's the case. I think what is healthy though is that more and more customers are saying, I want to have an open source strategy. I want my vendors to have an open source strategy. I want whatever products that I'm consuming for my infrastructure to have some sort of open source components. And so open source, I think, because it's a better way to innovate, is what's drawing out these bigger players to sort of tiptoeing into open source, saying, well, maybe we'll actually open source some things. Maybe we'll contribute a little bit. Maybe we'll contribute a little bit more. So if open source is a better innovation engine, then the people that need it to run their large-scale businesses are going to be pulled more and more into it. So I guess I'm an optimist that it's going to work out in the long run.
Are those companies that basically monopolize a certain open source project, is it really open source at that point, though? I mean, yeah, the license is there, but it's very much against the spirit of open source, isn't it?
Well, I would say that if they choose to change their license and sort of call it open source, but this is, I guess, sort of a literal answer is if the OSI says that license is not open source, then it's not open source. It's obviously a semantic argument. They can say, well, the source code is there. But if the license doesn't really give you the freedoms that were part of the original spirit and actually written down about what type of freedoms we expect to have if we are part of an open source movement and community, you start removing freedoms, then yeah, you're actually kind of, I would say, not really open source at that point.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying that that's evil. I mean, that's just a choice.
Right.
People make money. If it works for them, knock yourself out. But if you kind of want to have your cake and eat it too, at some point that you got to kind of commit, or just be a proprietary software company. I mean, that used to be the dominant model forever. Now people are sort of like open source is the default, and some companies are trying to kind of like thread the needle. But if you want to be a proprietary software company, nobody's stopping you from doing that either. But if you want to be open source, I'd say go with an OSI license, and you'll probably have a much bigger set of people showing up to help you. I mean, that's what I think is what drives that community growth in the first place.
Right, absolutely. So our time is pretty much up. But if we come back here next year, what do you think we'll be talking about?
Oh, wow. You really just threw that one on me at the end here.
Sorry.
Well, we're probably going to be talking about how right...
We said we'll do it live. It's live.
We're going to talk about how right or wrong I was about whatever I just said.
All right.
I predict that's going to be the hot topic.
Works for me.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you, Mark.